Bueno, puedo empezar a explicarles, por lo menos, esta es la bahía de Coos. So you get a better view now. Obviously, the mouth of the bay is here. The bay has this split shape you see here. So the six small watersheds are basically draining here parallel to each other. So that's an aerial view of the map you saw earlier. And all the urban development is along the shoreline, of course. And this is where the farmland in those flat areas is restricted. And as you can see, in a very short distance, the terrain goes up, becomes very steep, and that's where the logging and forestry takes place. So most of the land is actually under forest cover, but a lot of the players, a lot of the interest groups are associated with the lowland segment. Okay, what we're going to cover now, and be as brief and light as possible, considering that we just had lunch and you had a very heavy day talking about social issues, is how you involve the different players. I think this may be a bit more interesting than just talking about statistics or study designs. In many cases, you already know very more than I do about that. So let's see how you find this presentation. So we're going to talk about the landowner's decision-making process to buy into or say no to the proposed restoration work. Is their choice? What are the proportions or the rates of adoptions, positive responses we tend to get? The approaches that you can have to convince people, to get them on your side. And finally, getting also their involvement in the prioritization process, because one thing is for them to say, yeah, you can come to my property, and a different one is to say, I want to be part of the decision-making process. Not everybody is interested in all these different levels of participation. So what we have here is different layers of involvement and interest in what we may be proposing, or any NGO, non-government organization you may work with, or even the government may propose to them. So you have to go from the layer of knowledge, delivery, to persuasion, decision-making, then you go into the implementation phase of the project, and finally, you have to keep the landowners involved, confirming the results of your work, something that I believe you asked earlier with regards to if we keep a feedback loop going back over the years for people to know that they didn't waste their time and that things are moving forward. Now, in the persuasion may be efficient and you move to the decision-making process, or you may bounce against a wall and then you go back to having to be persuasive again. So you ask them for another date. If they say no, you wait a few days and then you call up and see if they're available for another date. There are points where you realize that you are never going to get to yes, but for the most part, many of the early rejections are overcome if you know how to do that. So basically, when we talk about knowledge, we are basically focusing on what makes a landowner potentially become involved with the restoration process, become curious about it. Someone, I think it was Carlos, was mentioning during the lunch break that if you go to people here, and it's the same whether you're in New Zealand or Chile, and tell them that what you're going to do is restore the ecological functions in order to, they just look at you and probably run away. But if you tell them that what you're dealing with is trying to solve flooding issues that have become worse, or drought-related issues because the river is very low, water quality, things that are close to their heart, then they're going to pay a little bit more attention. So the language and what you decide to put in front as part of your poster during the meetings and your announcements in the newspaper makes a huge difference. So you need to know what they are interested in. Many times you run a needs assessment. There is information in some cases there that maybe the municipality may have done independently of your work, and you can benefit from that. They may read about it in the media. Many times, in our case, they were contacted, directed, and other folks showed up at the meetings because they heard about it from people that they respected. So there are all these social networks that you need to more or less map on your blackboard before you decide to move ahead with invitations or putting flyers at different places in town, or whatever approach. You need to more or less do a little bit of an assessment and evaluation of what your audience is and which ways you have to get in contact with them. Things that you may want to have prepared are places that have successful restoration examples, what we call demonstration sites. And you may have on Earth Day, or now we're organizing with people from the Netherlands, Fish Passage Day. It's a certain day in April, and they have managed to have quite a bit of impact involving folks from 30 plus countries to do this thing on April the 26th or 27th. I'm going to try to start it next year. That's why I don't know the exact date. But the idea is to make sure that we reach the newspapers beforehand. We have some activities around the fish passage structures. That day, somehow, people hear the evening news may have 30 seconds or 2 minutes about fish passage, and they will become aware that that day in April is Fish Passage Day. In a place like Oregon, where we have so many dams and so many road culverts associated with logging, hopefully people will start realizing that fish passage issues are all around them. And that will put pressure on the politicians to have a different discussion about it. So demonstration sites, you may need to organize tours, booth of fairs. We do quite a bit of that, again, associated with Earth Day. In the summer in several places in Oregon, we have what we call Da Vinci Days, which is an association of science and art. A lot of art activities are used to expose people to rivers and water flowing and the values of nature. So you can approach it any way you think that your audience is going to reach. Now, to persuade a landowner, you may use different tools. Appeal to altruism, it may work with certain groups, but it's not necessarily the best or most useful approach. Normally, self-interest tends to, obviously, no-brainer, be more effective. Provide incentives is what the government does. They pay you, in many cases, to leave a certain chunk of land inactive for 15 or 30 years, and you receive like a rent for that period of time if you don't touch that land. Normally, these are wetlands, kind of the low part of the field that would yield less grain. So many farmers that are not paranoid about the government coming with black helicopters and taking over their property, which is more common than you would think, they would agree to sign a contract with the government for 15 or 30 years, because between the seed, the fertilizer, the gas, the manpower to get an additional 30 meters wide and 200 meter long strip of grain, and what they get in terms of the quality of that grain and the density of plants that grow in that lower portion, they're better off renting that land and just concentrating on the higher ground that may have better soil or whatever. So that's a program that is run through the Ministry of Agriculture that in the last 10, 15 years perhaps, because the years go by and I keep always saying 10 years, so it's probably 15 years now, the Ministry of Agriculture has these conservation programs that didn't exist before. So they give money for farmers to do what we call the right thing. And they have extension folks on their side to be talking to them and convince them about these things. And there are areas where it's becoming more and more common. In the valley, where the core valleys, in Portland, they are in a valley that is the Willamette Valley, is the last tributary of the Columbia, major tributary of the Columbia before you get to the ocean. In the last, again, 15, 18 years, a lot of vineyards starting to pop up. something trendy. If you have money, you don't know what to do, you buy a vineyard. And they started producing more and more wine. Some of it is good quality. Mostly the $80 bottles are good quality wine. The rest is almost undrinkable, but don't tell them that. Nonetheless, what I think is being an interesting revolution in that sense is that most of those wine-producing properties are either organic, or now they've been going for a new certification that is salmon-friendly or salmon-safe. So they have to meet certain standards in terms of if they apply chemicals, when they are supposed to apply them, what is the minimum amount. So they are organic plus a little bit more to be salmon-safe. And that didn't exist before. So there is a little bit of incentives, in this case, market incentives. There might have been some government subsidies there, I don't know about, but I wouldn't be surprised. The altruism, you can still make them believe that they are altruistic, but in reality, they only sign when they see the green papers. You may help them in many cases with the permit, and this is what many NGOs, like the ones I work with, do. For farmers to do certain things, especially if they change from one type of crop to a completely different one, because they decide that now growing this is not longer viable, there are certain regulations that become almost impossible to deal with unless you're an expert with paperwork. And there are many NGOs that assist these farmers with all the permitting process in exchange for saying, well, can we leave 30 meters along? And by the way, I can get you that contract with the government that will lease that land from you for, if you don't want 30 years, maybe you can do 15. So all that is a lot of what these watershed councils end up doing besides the restoration projects on the ground that we talked about earlier. So the job is endless. I mean, if the watershed councils that want to work, they have business for 365 days a year, 24 hours a day, and they need more people than they can afford. So again, ways to persuade the landowners. There is a person-to-person contact, and you do that with the landowners that you know they're progressive. Many of them, you already know them. There are certain profiles associated with the landowners that these watershed councils have been telling me about. A lot of the urban dwellers that move there, they tend to be greener than the long-time residents. You can convince many of the long-time residents, but after they see the other folks doing it. So there is a lot of peer group pressure. The farmers and small, even hobby farm owners, they tend to be looking at what's going on the other side of the fence all the time. So if the neighbor changed the crop, the irrigation, the animals, when they calf, the cows have their babies, anything they do, they seem to be checking what's going on. Like the urban folks are checking if the neighbor changes the car or bought a new laundry machine, and they want the same. It's human nature. So based on that, you can work it on to your advantage, and then the regulatory requirements is the last thing you want to approach them with. When you say, well, if you keep spraying with this pesticide this time of the year, when the rain is putting everything in the creek within 2 hours, we'll need to call the Department of Environmental Quality and you'll be in trouble. But that normally is the very last, I mean, it's in that list, but few, if any, of the watershed councils I know end up playing the regulatory card. It really doesn't work. If you got to yes, it's because in many cases, and they weren't even thinking about doing that, it's an indication that you establish a trustworthy relationship. You gain their trust, and therefore they went ahead and decided to do something and try something that they wouldn't have tried otherwise. The reputation of the organization is very important. That's why playing the regulatory card is dangerous, because even if that person was so irresponsible and was doing the worst thing in terms of spraying or dumping paint, or if you blew the whistle and called the authorities on them, they are not going to tell the truth. They are going to tell a story that suddenly will make everyone shut their door in your face when they see you coming, because they don't know that that person was actually doing the worst. It's like, I was just doing my job, my regular thing, and these folks came and called the authorities and I had to pay a fine. So again, another reason why the reputation has to be one of collaboration, one of building bridges, and when there are difficult people, which, I mean, they're abundant, you just avoid them and wait. John always says that restoration work can always be achieved one funeral at a time, as all folks who have been removing things, have been spraying with DDT or doing things that you wonder how they managed to survive with all the chemicals and the different stuff they were using, die off. Their children tend to be more educated, more sophisticated, and more concerned about what they handle, what they put in their food. So you have somebody else to talk to about changing things. Some of the farmers that in my vicinity, and I sample fish in their farms, many times laugh about and say, if my father or if my grandfather saw me doing this, they would turn over in their grave. So they're still thinking, oh my God, I'm doing exactly the opposite than my grandfather did. I hope he's not watching. So it gives you a sense of how human psyche works about those things that is a tradition. You need to be, when you have these discussions, you present material at the meetings, you even look at demonstration sites to take them to, you need to be aware of what their needs are. If your demonstration sites are about fish passage and you know that people are concerned about flood, you're not going to get their attention for long. Even if the fish passage issue is very important, they're interested in about lack of water, arsenic in the water, something else. So you need to basically, at minimum, cover some of their expectations, or you won't get them at the table. Be patient. You have to present them with a plan. So similar to what the Coos watershed did in terms of introducing themselves and saying, okay, we are not getting together as a social club just to have barbecue salmon once a month. This is what we want to achieve. They did a lot of what we call envisioning. So basically they asked people about, why do they live where they live? It's a difficult question, or at least not that relevant of a question to ask someone in a city. But when they bought a piece of land, or they inherited it, but they kept it rather than put it in the market and take off, you want to know why are they still there? And some places you think, well, they could be in an easier place to live, where the winter is not, where it doesn't flood, where it doesn't snow. Nonetheless, they are still there. So, and many people in these surveys, which we did during the first coffee clutch, by the way, they tell you, we like it because we love nature. They may be killing it, but there is a lot of disconnect, which also comes up in these surveys very clearly. One clear example that I always remember is, I love my property or my valley because of the frogs and their songs. Next, second answer, I'm concerned about water and flooding. And I was wondering, you know, she has frogs all over the place, which brings her pleasure because there's water all over the place. So you don't expect a lot of coherence, but you get a sense of what people want. And the next thing you do is, if you want it, close your eyes and envision, and this is the name of the exercise, envision your valley in 15 years, and envision the valley you would like to leave your children, and open your eyes again and look at it in 50 years. What is that comes up to the surface? What are the things you would like to still see and not be lost? And 19, 18, 17 out of 20 people in the room are going to say the nature, the wildlife, the birds, the water, all the things that the conservation group is trying to keep from falling apart. Nobody's going to tell you, oh, we want more cars and more paved roads and parking lots and a Walmart, whether they are telling the truth or not. But by the sheer numbers, you can tell that these people really want long-term, especially if it doesn't cost them a penny and they don't need to change their ways, they want a valley that looks as beautiful as you can possibly imagine. So as a part of that exercise, you kind of explain why you want to do what you are proposing in your plan. So you need to have that put in the context of, see, we're all going in the same direction. We're all pulling in the same direction. And if we don't do anything, in 50 years, this valley is not going to be like what you envision in your dreams. It's going to be down a pipe. It may be divided into half-acre lots with a lot of houses and 5-story high buildings. It may happen. It has happened in California all over the place. When we look at California, it's easy because we tell Oregonians, do you want this to look like California? And they say, no way, no way. We don't even want the Californians to move here because Californians find property in Oregon very cheap. So as soon as they retire, they sell a house for $2 million and they buy 7 houses in Oregon with that money. So they can look at next door and see what happens if you don't regulate the growth and the use of land, which actually is more regulated in Oregon than it is in California by far. The cities have borders, limits, not walls, but limits in paper that even if your property is a piece of farm on the other side of that road, you cannot suddenly divide it and build condos or houses there. That is farmland, and in order to change the status of that, you have to be the son of the governor of the state because it's very, very difficult. And that has kept a lot of valuable farmland from being taken over by the spread of Portland. Portland hasn't spread the way other cities do because of that regulation which came up in 85 or 86, which is a land use regulation. When things go wrong, you need to have a plan B. Always prepare these things in advance in terms of restoration projects that don't work, strategies on how you're going to implement it to be able to correct things. The monitoring, the follow-up has to be explained, especially when you say, well, we're going to try something new here, but we'll do it at a small scale, and we promise that we'll be collecting data for the next 2 or 3 years. And only if it works the way it is and it doesn't damage your property or that, then we'll try it. And there will always be someone who will say, okay, yeah, you can try that in my property, but you need to explain also, well, if it blows off and it takes a chunk of your riverbank, what are we going to do in order to compensate or make up? Some people may not expect compensation, which is the situation you may want to be because you don't want to be liable for something that happened naturally and all of a sudden you're not going to pay that landowner money, but you want to have that discussion up front. If they say, well, no, if it happens, it happens, I accept the risk, but let's make sure that not everybody else is affected by this. So you start identifying the players with whom you can experiment and with whom you can try different things. And this is going back to the question that you asked earlier. You keep the landowners involved by confirming that you're monitoring the results, that you're learning from your mistakes, and that you expect mistakes, but the system is designed by intelligent people, so you're going to not repeat them, hopefully, in the future by monitoring closely. If something needs maintenance, particularly if it's associated with some structures, driveways, access to properties, little bridges, what have you, fencing, that there is a plan for maintenance, and if the maintenance becomes the landowner responsibility, that's also clear because watershed councils that don't communicate and they just do whatever they have the chance to do in a rush and they don't tell people, oh, once we put the fence, which is, by the way, costing us $10,000 and the government is giving us a grant for another 10, and you're not putting a penny, that's it, that's our gift. You should be happy that your sheep are not falling in the creek any longer, but if it falls apart in 3 years, it's your problem, don't call me. You don't put it in those terms, you're kind of nicer and more patient, but that's the message. And if you accept the responsibility of fixing it, then make sure that you do. It has to be very honest and an honorable process to keep you going. Now, you have about 5 types of landowner behaviors to deal with. That's in John's experience, and also in the literature, he found this type of segregation. You have the innovators, the early adopters, the early majority, which is about 1/3 of your population. Another third is your late majority, and then there are the ones that are always going to be dragging their feet and probably never going to make it. The more friendly ones may say, yeah, we'll do it. But in reality, they're not planning to do it. They just cannot say no in your face. But you cannot work with them. So, depending on their personality, your easy time to work with them is going to be all over the map. And this is roughly the distribution of these personalities. So as I said, the innovators that want to try anything new and they are very cool with experimenting are a very small fraction, but you find them. So you would deal about 1 to 3% of the population. The early adopters are about 10 to 15%, and they follow this because as soon as you have 1 or 2 demonstration sites from which you learn and you can tell them, well, we made a mistake here, but now we know how to correct it, they want to try it too. The early majority is once you have something that is really well proven, and their numbers seem to be around 30%. Then this group only comes into the picture once everybody else that was friendly towards your cause has done it. And then you have about 15 to 20% that never are going to be part of your team. And you have to live with that. If this is the cumulative percentage, so eventually you get to 100%, although in reality it would be more like 85% since these guys are never going to work with you. But that's how you account for 100% of your audience. How are we doing for time? We have 15 more minutes? Yes. So I'll finish with this psychological thriller, and we'll have questions, and then Carlos can start. So basically, as far as their psychological profile, the innovators are willing to take risks. Don't be surprised if they tend to be younger than your average landowner. Normally, they are their children or young professionals that just bought the property, and they have complete different ideas. And they bought the property because they wanted land, and they wanted trees, and they wanted water. And while they were working in the city, they were supporting the Nature Conservancy every month, donating to Greenpeace. So those are the ones that probably, as soon as they're approached by the Watershed Council, they just roll the red carpet. Very small fraction, again, but it's critical to identify them. Many of them show up at the Watershed Council meeting almost spontaneously once they get to the neighborhood. So financially, they are in a good position. If they have to pay for something, they don't care. They may not change the Volvo for the new model, but they don't worry too much about it. They put it in the new bridge that is not going to affect fish passage. And they are normally drinking beer and having salmon barbecues with people of the same kind. So once you get 1 or 2 of them, if there are 10 others in the watershed, you get them. And those are the ones that the Watershed Council targets first, because you want these examples and you want to experiment with these projects of different types to see what goes wrong, what works, how much it ends up costing. They've done this for years before, probably 10 years, since the mid-90s until 2005, before they came up with, okay, now let's do the prioritization for all these menu of things. A lot of the techniques they were proposing, they had already tried them, so they knew pretty much what to put, how much it cost, who in the area could be the contractor for that, because sometimes they had to contract out. The 2-guy log or the 3-guy log wasn't always the case. They need heavy machinery or other stuff. The fact that they get involved is seen as sort of a cause of curiosity and fun by their neighbors, because their neighbors know that these guys are weird, odd, strange. And they say, oh yeah, so-and-so, but he's crazy. But that's okay, as long as they are not too crazy and not too out of the average of the population. If they are seen as hardworking folks and they have a family and hopefully they go to church or they pretend that they do that, they would be wacky, which is kind of term for a little bit crazy, but they are respected. Again, you can put the demonstration sites there and their connections are very valuable. Now, the early adopters are kind of a second tier of that. They are not as extreme, but they also, you're dealing with a young segment of the population highly educated for the most part, very similar, higher social status in the community. As difference with the innovators is that they tend to be local. The innovators many times just parachuted in from the city and they don't even know what they are doing, and they open their doors. These guys, in many cases, are the children of the previous generation who got a university education and they want to keep the property for mostly sentimental reasons. But they know what they want to do. They don't want to live off the land. At most, they may rent it out to somebody else, but they don't want to work there. But because that income is not that important to them, they don't mind leaving buffer strips. They don't mind putting money into fencing or things of that sort. They tend to be, because they are the children of people who have lived there for 2 generations, then they tend to be opinion leaders in the community. Those are not seen by the neighbors as wacky people from the city any longer. It's the Peterson's son or the Jefferson's daughter, who they've seen in church since she was 5. And if she does that, that has a lot of value for your plan. So basically, others will be accepting that when they see that Mary Jefferson is doing it. So there can not be anything wrong with it. So you want these folks on your board. Basically, the advisory board, the Watershed Council has an advisory board. These are the people that John wants to be at their board. He wants other people too, but these are the core group that is always going to be there. And if one doesn't have the time to participate any longer, he tries to replace it with an equivalent neighbor so he doesn't lose this progressive group. The early majority are always looking at what these early adopters do. They are kind of behind in the sense that they wait to see what these individuals that they know by name, by family name, by other reasons do. And they may have some leadership group role in the community, but they are not as important or as influential. They may actually work for the municipality, even some of them may be politicians, but they don't have the same status in terms of influence of what they say and what they do in the community at large. As far as the economic status goes, it's kind of intermediate. It's middle class, but they are not as well positioned as the others or as secure. So if they're going to do something in the land, they're a little bit more thrifty with the money. If you pay for the project, that's great, but if they have to participate 50-50, then you may need to talk to them 2 or 3 times or more. But they are an important number. Here we're talking about 10%, 15%. These guys are 30%. So if you are going to make a difference in your watershed, you need that group. Between these 3, you're getting about 2/3 of your land ownership cover. The late majority are skeptical about the restoration that you're proposing, what your objectives are. They don't want to be part of it. They're kind of forced, they kind of drag by the rest into adopting that. They tend to be in lower income bracket. They have less resources, so they're trying to make money out of every corner of their property. And they cannot invest a penny even in new fencing. You see their properties are kind of falling apart. And you think, you know, you could benefit with a new barn, but the new barn should be not in the floodplain. Well, why don't we put the, but they don't want to even think about it because they cannot afford it. So you realize where you can predict, according to John, how they're going to behave when you start coming along with these plans. And for those, you need to provide a lot more incentives and help. And then if you say, well, we'll cover the fences, we'll move the barn, let us reconfigure part of the creek in exchange, no? Because otherwise, what are you doing? Let us reconfigure part of the creek or have some wetland habitat in the winter. Your cows or sheep can be there in the summer because it's dry anyway. But in the winter, move your sheep out of there, put them in the barn, which now is going to be drier higher up in the slope of the hill, and let the fish use that wetland, which until now you have somehow divorced from the creek. So you can get those by bargaining that way. And then you have the ones that are focused on what it was done when the human race began producing agricultural products They don't want any change. They tend to be elderly, and they don't want to be bothered, truly. If you go to their property and tell them, well, they just, not all of them are completely antagonistic. They just don't have time. Some of them may be dealing with chronic disease, children that are away and not paying attention to them. In many situations, you run into these cases. The family network that you see here, it doesn't exist in the US. So you may go into a ranch or farm and you find a 70-year-old lady who is living there by herself, and because of the culture she comes from, and self-sufficiency and distance from the kids, they are barely surviving there without falling in the bathroom and being found dead later on. A lot of these people may be disconnected from the community. So it's not that they are not interested, they just can't. They are dealing with too much stress with their health and other issues. The last thing is 3 kids from the Watershed Council knocking at their door saying, why don't we move your fence and that way? But they're a small proportion of the population anyway. Again, you saw this earlier. What I want to point out here is the central role that the involvement and through these coffee clutches have. I mentioned this earlier, what we did at every coffee clutch, so I won't repeat that since I only have 2 minutes. What I wanted to show is, as part of that envisioning exercise, we also asked them to tell us, just to know a little bit about them and show that you care, give us your list of concerns. Let's see what is going on in the watershed from a natural process and human land use perspective that is worrying you. And they all gave either first position was what bothers them or concerns them the most, so that's represented in blue. In burgundy is their second concern, and in white their third concern. So the drainage, the management of drainage structures at a watershed level and at a personal property level rank the highest. This is not surprising because I think if this is the very first group I remember, the very first meeting, it had a lot of people from the floodplain. So what they are talking about are dikes and tie gates. So that dominated their concerns. They were thinking, if nobody maintains these things, or if the plan here is to remove them, I'm concerned. So basically, you can get a picture that is useful in some ways. The sample is small, so you cannot, based on one survey in one meeting, write a book about it. But once you accumulate from 6 different watershed councils, watersheds, at a minimum, you have the opinion of 60 to 120 people, and you can start changing some of your plans for the next meeting based on what you receive in that very simple survey. These are the other coffee clutches I mentioned earlier what we did. This is the graph that I wanted to show you earlier, where we have, this is the answer to the survey we sent to the more general group in terms of their concerns. These are the rankings from 0 to 4.5. These are the different activities: replace culverts, maintain ditches, protect areas from recurring landslides. So these are all actions. Based on the work we've done, we asked people for their own property, how much of a concern was that? And that's the red line. In terms of their neighborhood, so not just their property, maybe the culvert is not a problem in their property, but looking one property up and one property down, what structures, actions are needed, and they are concerned about them either being carrying out or not being carried at all. So they identified in the light blue how much of their immediate vicinity was of concern to them. The yellow is the community in general, so they think about the entire watershed, and they think, well, again, culvert replacement, which is underneath every single driveway, because most properties are on the other side of the creek, and everyone drives, and there is this culvert underneath the road that is either suspended, it's being clogged. They're not concerned that much about, many of them, about whether it's suspended or not and the fish can pass. What they are concerned about the fact that the culverts get plugged with wood, and then when they're coming home in the evening, the whole thing is covered with water. So who's going to replace the culvert? They consider it's the municipality or the county because it's by the road, but it's actually inside their property. Once you leave the road, you're in their property, but many of them want help or some type of assistance replacing what is their driveway. So this is a concern. And the green light, the green bar, is basically what we had predicted based on the smaller group with the 4 or 5 representatives that were joining us at these discussions, and gave us, except for some cases like the addition of off-channel habitat or some other ones, our perception of their concerns or their interests track reality quite closely. So we are not completely off, and that was reassuring in many ways. We won't deal with that, and this is it for this session. Thank you for coming back after lunch. I really appreciate it, for staying awake. And now let's see if you have a couple of questions before we let Carlos take the floor.
Sido lo suficientemente seductor como tu propuesta, porque si no va de alguna forma a fracasar. A nosotros yo creo que muchas veces nos cuesta hacer ese camino, entre otras cosas, porque él ha hablado antes de que ir con la ley en la mano, que te denuncio, que tal, que no sé qué nosotros, pues no era lo más recomendable. Entonces, bueno, lo dicen desde la perspectiva de que ellos no son, digamos, el organismo regulador.
Claro.
Nosotros en cambio sí, y entonces nos cuesta muchas veces el no hacer las cosas así, porque es así, porque la ley lo dice así, porque lo digo yo o porque tal. Pero yo entiendo que hay muchas cosas que desde luego no son negociables y no son renegociables, porque hay ciertos aspectos, yo que sé, pues luego puede ser una autorización, algo que es evidente, como alguien no puede correr a 180, pero sobre todo cuando hablamos de proyectos de conservación y de protección de la naturaleza, porque la Junta lo puede saber mejor, el hecho de que haya una ley que dice que no puedes envenenar, que no tal, que no sé cuántos, por mucho que vayas de la ley de la mano, si no llegas a algún tipo de persuasión a los agricultores, cazadores, te van a echar el veneno, te van a dar, o sea, cualquier cosa, por mucho que vayas amenazando, no vas a conseguir absolutamente nada. Entonces, yo creo que en ese sentido hay ciertas cosas que nosotros no podemos renunciar nunca a ellas, porque son absolutamente necesarias, porque ejercemos esa labor reguladora de policía, pero me cuesta creer que no haya muchísimas otras cosas en las que no seamos capaces de llegar a algún tipo de entendimiento, acuerdo, etc. Y yo creo que ahí está el quid de la cuestión, en que seamos capaces de persuadir, de seducir, etc., porque hay muchas veces que es que tampoco sabemos qué es lo que ellos realmente quieren. Y a mí muchas veces me hace preguntar, muchas veces no nos hemos puesto en el ejercicio de lo que nuestras necesidades no tienen por qué ser las mismas de sus necesidades. A lo mejor estamos incluso ejecutando obras innecesarias que ellos ni siquiera las valoran, y a lo mejor merece la pena antes de nada preguntarles a ellos qué quieren o a qué cosas les dan más valor, porque nos dan pistas de por dónde reconducir las cosas o dónde compensar en ciertas cosas para conseguir al final nuestros objetivos. Yo, por ejemplo, no sé si Mónica has hecho alguno de estos cursos del Ministerio, de cuando hablan de negociación, lo primero que nos dicen preguntar ¿cómo vas a ofrecer, cómo vas a establecer una negociación o algo si no sabes cuál es la demanda, la necesidad de lo que preguntar? Entonces, básicamente aquí en un proyecto de restauración se me ocurre o de conservación de la naturaleza o lo que sea, también debemos conocer qué es lo que quieren, demandan, porque a lo mejor con lo que ellos se satisfacen es realmente muy poco, y que nos cuesta muy poco ceder en eso, y con eso ganamos mucho. Luego también he notado aquí una idea muy interesante que he apuntado de persuasión, es que que es un congreso seminario de seguimiento, todos estos datos están avalados, digamos, por seguimientos socioculturales,
socioeconómicos.
que realmente hay datos ahí detrás.
Y
Cuando preguntan a todo el mundo que en temas relacionados con la conservación, etcétera, qué es lo que esperan en un futuro, parece ser que todo el mundo, y probablemente nosotros coincidiríamos, que todos queremos algo, digamos, idílico, que la naturaleza, la conservación. Pues yo creo que ahí hay una línea bastante importante de seducción a la hora de, sobre todo, la gente mayor de los pueblos, etcétera, de que es, porque ellos seguramente que lo que quieren es dejar algo bueno, está. Entonces, ahí yo creo que es interesante. Luego también ha estado hablando de la comunicación, hablando de los diferentes perfiles, digamos, sociológicos de las personas. Cada uno de nosotros, los técnicos de la Junta, o nosotros mismos, cuando nos dirigimos a las personas, pues nos encontramos desde el pie de la vara hasta el listillo de Madrid, que le llamamos así, además un poco despectivamente, que viene a pasar el verano, no sé qué, tal. Entonces, lo que es importante es que hay que establecer un canal de comunicación, hay que saber a quién nos dirigimos, que todas las aportaciones son importantes y que luego a la hora de persuadir, de seducir, también hay que saber a quién nos dirigimos. Ha apuntado que hay ciertos colectivos que tienen poco peso a la hora de, digamos, de arrastrar al resto de gente, pero hay colectivos que prácticamente, si no cuentas con ellos, el proyecto es un desastre, porque son, digamos, los que tienen más respeto, gente más respetada en la comunidad, o la gente que tiene, digamos, como más credibilidad,
más
más
pasión.
más pasión, lo que sea. Aquí a lo mejor, esto es muy americano, pero aquí sería a lo mejor el alcalde, digamos, con esa adhesión política que haya tal, o el tío de no sé qué. En todos los pueblos, en todos los sitios, seguro que hay gente, o colectivos, o asociaciones que tienen mucho peso. Pues evidentemente, ganarse a esas personas resulta fundamental a la hora de plantear un proyecto. Y yo, y esto lo digo de mi propia experiencia, por fracasos, evidentemente, que cuando nos dirigimos presentando una idea que puede ser fabulosa o a nosotros nos parece fabulosa, la primera impresión es fundamental, porque las resistencias que puedas generar en ese momento son enormes. Y si no eres capaz de comunicarte bien con el dirigente, de tal, no sé, seducir, etc., cuesta muchísimo dar la vuelta a la tortilla y tratar de convencer a una persona que, igual que una persona cuando tú la ves, a lo mejor en los primeros 30 segundos te enamoras, ya no te enamoras o tal, pues muchas veces cuando vas a persuadir a una persona pasa exactamente lo mismo. Y en la primera página
Total.
la puedes absolutamente cagar.
Yo tengo un ejemplo muy claro con dos grupos que están cerca de nuestra universidad, consejos de Cuenca. Uno tiene chicas universitarias, casi todas de familias agrícolas, es decir, que saben de lo que hablan cuando van al campo, y los granjeros inmediatamente lo detectan, si es de la ciudad o no, y son muy proper, ¿no? Es decir, vestidas, todo como si fueran las hijas o las nietas de ellos. Y hay otro grupo que un año contrató dos estudiantes de la universidad de sociología pensando, bueno, estos chicos iban con la cabeza rapada, con aretes por todos lados y con tatuajes. Imagínate la respuesta. Pero no lo estoy inventando, incluso estoy viendo la cara de uno de estos muchachos, a mí me daba miedo. Le toca a la puerta a un granjero y le viene no lo dejan ni terminar de hablar. Es fundamental.
O a la hora, por ejemplo, yo veo, por ejemplo, muy interesante cuando planteamos cosas que no las planteamos habitualmente, pero simplemente las hacemos, pero cuando alguna vez hemos planteado alguna cosa, hay veces que puede ser interesante, en vez de comunicarlo de forma general, así como abiertamente, y que se forme ya el lío, pues puedes hacer una estrategia de tratar de convencer, pues primero al alcalde, el petit comité, luego a no sé quién, no sé cuántos, y luego ya cuando abordas todo el grupo, ya tienes unos apoyos iniciales que son importantísimos a la hora bueno, de intentar persuadir y convencer, y sobre todo que nadie te reviente una reunión o nadie te reviente un acto o alguna cosa parecida. Y ya para tal, pues lo de las perfiles de las personas es muy americano. Aquí tendremos otros perfiles, pero podríamos decir básicamente lo mismo. Y esto, al fin y al cabo, son estudios, por lo que nos cuenta Guillermo, que están seguidos.
El capítulo 4 de John sobre cómo involucrarlos tiene toda la bibliografía, así que a los que les interesa pueden... Sí, no, la diferencia no es tan grande. Con respecto a la regulación que me dices, ahí creo que hay una diferencia que está basada, además de cuestiones culturales, que no está divorciado de lo legal. El tema legal, el problema de crear un precedente, el sistema jurídico no es el napoleónico con códigos, sino se basa en precedentes. Las agencias que regulan y que tendrían que ir a decirle al granjero tal, no puede hacer esto, multa, tienen miedo de que si el granjero tiene un abogado y lo lleva a la corte y por alguna razón o les toca a un juez loco o el abogado es muy bueno o ese día tuvieron mala suerte, el juez falla en su contra, esa herramienta que la agencia reguladora tenía desaparece. Entonces, hasta llegar a ese punto, para llegar a ese punto, primero que tienen que tener tanta evidencia para demostrar que esa persona está haciendo algo que va a tener un impacto contra un acta como el acta de las especies en peligro, Endangered Species Act o List, que hace que muchos ahora, en los últimos 12 años que estos grupos existen, primero se acerquen al Consejo de Cuenca y digan, estos granjeros de aquí o estos propietarios forestales están haciendo las cosas de manera tal que están en el límite de lo legal. Ustedes no pueden trabajar con ellos y ver si los pueden convertir. Como están en el límite de lo legal, la agencia reguladora tiene miedo de llevarlos a la corte y perder, porque entonces la riegan.
Hombre, aquí en España la cosa es diferente, porque yo creo que aquí la administración pasa bastante rodillo, pero hay un derecho administrativo. Claro, por eso que digo que no es, pero me refiero que no es como en Estados Unidos, que es un poco más todo... Más civil, más... Resuelven las cortes, digamos, los tribunales ordinarios. Aquí tenemos un derecho administrativo muy potente.
Claro.
Hay un demanio, hay cosas que allí
no existen.
Pero los precedentes o los jueces a veces dictan barbaridades.
Bueno, ya también.
Pero no se convierte en ley.
Claro.
Es la diferencia. Para que aquí una barbaridad dictada por un tribunal se convierta en ley, tiene que ser el Supremo y tienen que ser 5 barbaridades. O sea, 5 sentencias en esa línea, eso marca jurisprudencia, pero es un tribunal altísimo. O sea, que
Sí.
los ordinarios, digamos, los superiores de justicia, las audiencias, unas dicen esto, otras dicen otro. Las mismas, diferentes salas dentro del mismo tribunal, le dicen cosas diferentes, por ejemplo, en responsabilidades civiles por inundaciones. Es frecuentísimo que a este le tengamos que indemnizar y al lado no, porque han ido a
diferentes cortes.
Pero en cualquier caso, ya hace mención que aquí el derecho administrativo es muy potente y prácticamente todas estas cuestiones se resuelven por vía administrativa. Entonces, lo importante no es, digamos, un tema legal, sino lo importante es que proyectos de restauración o de conservación de la naturaleza, etcétera, al final hay comportamientos que con el arma ese de la legalidad pues se podrían, si tuvieras a lo mejor una persona todo el día en una cámara, pero desde luego lo que hay que hacer es explorar otras vías. Vamos.
Y lo que tú dices de los cazadores y el veneno y ese tipo de... Hay cosas que no las puedes lograr. Si te los pones en contra, aunque no lo harían porque les cuesta dinero o va en contra de sus intereses, simplemente por demostrar un punto, lo van a...
O prácticas muy extendidas estas de toda la vida, o que de repente pesquen con trasmayo, o que uno abra una cacera y seque el río durante unas horas para regar un pradito, o tal. O sea, hay ciertos comportamientos que no puedes escapar. ¿Alguna pregunta?
Más bien un comentario. Vamos, hablaría un poco, vamos a hablar desde la administración, desde el punto de vista de una ONG, ¿no? De una fundación que trabajamos por la conservación de la naturaleza y quizá
Sí, sí, sí.
No, pero
Tendrían que ser todos capaces un poco quizá de complementarnos para conseguir llegar más lejos.
no, pero sí es cierto que aparte que hay ciertas cosas que probablemente se consigan mejor pues, a través de proyectos de custodia del territorio, etcétera, porque donde pueden llegar esas asociaciones de custodia del territorio seguramente no llega la administración y juegan otro papel diferente pero perfectamente complementario. Y no sé, la Confederación, por ejemplo, del Duero ha impulsado varios proyectos de custodia del territorio, 5 me dice Celia, 4 firmados, o sea que es algo relativamente nuevo en los últimos 3-4 años, pero ya hay ciertas experiencias de custodia del territorio y algunas con éxito pues,
Además, también la línea de lo que estabas comentando de vas a decir de que la gente desafía del territorio que han persuadido, vamos a decir, las reticencias o roto las reticencias y las barreras que había en ese territorio. En cierta medida no se ha roto todo ni se ha llegado a un acuerdo ya, pero poco a poco se puede entrar porque ellos han abierto ya el camino. La agricultura tuvieron estas
y nosotros
organizaciones.
también nos hemos apoyado en ello, por ejemplo con la Fundación Tormes, que trabaja en Salamanca, donde está Trider, pues nos hemos apoyado en ellos para llegar a o hacer ciertas cosas que por nosotros mismos nos gustaría muchísimo, muchísimo hacerlo. Entonces, bueno, pues sí que yo creo que sí que se va avanzando, incluso en estos proyectos LIFE, que es un poco el objeto del proyecto, hay, aparte de que hay una convocatoria especial para ONGs, también cada vez dan más peso a todo lo que concierne con custodia del territorio. En esos stakeholders y tal, todo el tema de custodia del territorio le dan